On December 20th, 1860, a group of South Carolina secessionists set off a chain of events that ultimately resulted in the deaths of 620,000 American soldiers during 4 years of bloody Civil War. This presentation outlines the cause of the war from source documents of the men who lived during that time and made the decisions which led to the conflict. The unique aspect of this presentation is utilizing the truth of God's Word to shed light on the reason why the war was fought and God's purpose for America by allowing the war. By the time of the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln in March of 1861, 7 Southern states had seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis was appointed president of this new country. These Southern states had confiscated federal property and military installations that were located in these states. President James Buchanan failed to take decisive action with the secessionists during his last few months of office before Abraham Lincoln. One federal outpost held by the Union, located in the middle of Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, was Fort Sumter. This fort was garrisoned by a handful of federal soldiers, and by the beginning of April 1861 was low on provisions. Lincoln attempted to resupply the fort. However, Southern artillery kept the ships from getting to the fort. There was a touch of irony between the commander of the fort and the commander of the Southern troops. Major Robert Anderson, a Kentuckian married to a woman from Georgia, stayed loyal to the Union and commanded the garrison at Fort Sumter. He was a former instructor at the West Point Military Academy. One of his former students at West Point, General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, commanded the Confederate forces. Fort Sumter was surrounded by Confederate gun batteries, and finally the Southern commander gave an ultimatum to surrender or be fired upon. Major Anderson declined to surrender, so at approximately 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, the Civil War officially began with the firing on Fort Sumter. Within 33 hours of the initial firing on Fort Sumter, Major Anderson surrendered the fort. The Confederacy was elated and thought that their independence would shortly be a reality. This event started the country down the bloody road of civil war. Both sides believed that the conflict would be short-lived, but not everyone was convinced that this war would be over in 90 days. Shortly before the outbreak of the war, General William T. Sherman was serving as superintendent of a Southern military school located in Louisiana. Sherman discussed the folly of secession with one of the Southern instructors at the school. He emphatically stated,
"You people of the South don't know what you're doing. This country will be drenched in blood, and God only knows how it will end. It is all folly, madness, a crime against civilization. You people speak so lightly of war. You don't know what you're talking about. War is a terrible thing."
Texas Governor Sam Houston took a stand against seceding from the Union and finally was removed as governor after his refusal to side with the secessionists. He told them,
"Some of you laugh to scorn the idea of bloodshed as the result of secession, but let me tell you what is coming. After the sacrifice of countless millions of treasure and hundreds of thousands of lives, you may win Southern independence, but I doubt it. The North is determined to preserve this Union. They are not a fiery, impulsive people as you are, for they live in colder climates. But when they begin to move in a given direction, they move with the steady momentum and perseverance of a mighty avalanche."
Both Sherman and Houston were prophetic in their statements pertaining to the results of secession. God's purpose was to deliver America from slavery. Changing the hearts and minds of Americans, as well as the war aim of the North, would take more than 3 months. After the surrender of Fort Sumter, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. This action offended other Southern states, and 4 additional states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, joined the Confederacy. The Civil War pitted brother against brother, father against son, and father-in-law against son-in-law. Families were torn apart. Virtually every family in the United States would be affected in some way by the Civil War. It truly was America's baptism by fire. The reason given to fight the war by Northern politicians and military leaders at the beginning of the war was to preserve the Union. God's plan was to preserve the Union by delivering that Union from the evils of slavery. Until the North's war aim was changed, success on the battlefield was not forthcoming. A logistical decision by the Confederate government in 1861 impacted the struggles in the Eastern Theater over the next 4 years. At its inception, the Confederate government chose Montgomery, Alabama, as the site of their capital. Within a few months, however, the location of the Confederate capital was changed to Richmond, Virginia. The distance from Washington to Richmond was a mere 100 miles, and most of the battles in the East occurred at locations between these two capitals. The first major land battle of the war occurred on July 21, 1861, only 30 miles from the federal capital of Washington City. The Federal Army consisted of 35,000 soldiers, with the Confederate Army totaling 32,500 soldiers. After the shooting stopped, the combined casualties were almost 5,000. This battle was known as the First Battle of Bull Run in the North and the Battle of First Manassas in the South. Most Americans believed that one major battle would end the war. Soldiers were eager to fight in the battle, so they did not miss the excitement. This eagerness would diminish quickly as the war dragged on. The Federal troops were winning the day until a Confederate charge under the leadership of an obscure military college professor from Virginia won the day. General Thomas J. Jackson was a committed Christian whose habit was to pray almost continually. His legendary status as a Civil War general began with that Confederate charge. In attempting to encourage his retreating troops, Southern General Bernard Bee saw Jackson standing calmly and yelled,
"There stands Jackson like a stone wall! Rally behind the Virginians!"
From this battle onward, the name Stonewall Jackson became famous throughout the South and the North. The charge by the Virginians turned the tide of battle, and the Federal Army began retreating. The retreat became a rout, with troops fleeing panic-stricken back to Washington. The Northern populace was shocked and dismayed at the loss of the battle and the enormous bloodshed. Little did anyone know that this was just the beginning of dozens of major battles that would inflict hundreds of thousands of casualties. The devastating impact of war on civilians would be felt throughout the conflict, and the Battle of First Manassas was no different. A Confederate headquarters was set up in the home of Wilmer McLean. During the battle, a Union shell crashed into his living room. In an attempt to escape the war, McLean moved away to a small Virginian hamlet 100 miles southwest of Manassas. He would play a prominent part in the final proceedings of the war. Within days of the battle, President Lincoln replaced General McDowell with General George B. McClellan. Shortly after taking command, McClellan wrote to his wife,
"I feel that God has placed a great work in my hands. I have not sought it. I know how weak I am, but I know that I mean to do right, and I believe that God will help me and give me the wisdom I do not possess."
As a great organizer, he spent the remainder of 1861 drilling the troops and preparing for a major offensive in the East. The year 1861 ended with a realization in both the North and South that the war would be a protracted conflict with no foreseeable end. Both armies prepared for the clashes that would inevitably come the following spring. Before moving on to 1862, consider the following quote by a Southern soldier summing up the conflict.
"I pity the wounded soldiers and the wives, mothers, and sisters that lost dear ones in the battle. Surely God is judging his people. Everyone ought to humble themselves in sackcloth and ashes, and fast and pray to God to spare us and save us from war and bloodshed.